It's a cold morning in the year 1830. You stand in the heart of Yorkshire, where the faintest light of dawn struggles to break through a pale, misty sky. The cobblestones beneath your boots are slick with frost, and as you breathe, your breath forms small clouds in the air, blending into the chill. The sounds of the market stir around you, but they are not the bustling excitement of trade or chatter. No, these sounds carry an edge, something different, something deeply unsettling. Your heart pounds in your chest as the murmurs of the crowd grow louder, and a sharp dread twists in your stomach. The rough, scratchy sensation around your neck jolts you back to reality. The rope halter, tighter than you'd like, designed for livestock, but now wrapped around you. It is not a mark of protection, but a symbol of your status in this strange and humiliating spectacle. Your husband's calloused hand grips the other end of the rope, and his voice rings out with the practiced tone of a market auctioneer, despite the slurred edges of the morning ale still lingering on his breath. "What am I bid for this fine woman?" he calls out, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. The words are not spoken with love or even indifference, but with a strange, detached confidence. His eyes wander across the market square, and you see them all of them eyes scanning you, sizing you up as though you were a cow, a piece of property, something to be sold. His eyes flick to your rough hands, checking for calluses, ensuring you are fit for work. He glances at your face, trying to determine if you can still warm a man's bed. He describes you to the men in the crowd, your ability to cook, to clean, to bear children, your strength. But as they circle closer, you remain still, your mind whirling. You wonder if one of these men will offer you a better future than the cruel hand you've been dealt, or if you will be trapped in a new nightmare, one even worse than the last. The horrifying part. This isn't a crime. This isn't some desperate act of madness. This is legal. This is permissible. This, in the twisted logic of your world, is your best chance at freedom. And so you stand there, every second stretching out before you, knowing that your entire life could change in the next few minutes. You could find yourself with a kinder master, or one much crueler. But no matter what happens, this moment of degradation, this spectacle, is the only choice your society allows you. It's either this, or remain a prisoner in a marriage that has already broken you. As the bidding begins, each offer is an echo of your own desperate calculations. With every offer, you wonder, will this be the man who treats you with dignity? Or will he simply continue the cycle of your suffering, now under a new roof? In Victorian England, the laws governing marriage were suffocating in their rigidity, especially for women. The doctrine of coverture held that a woman, once married, ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. As Sir William Blackstone famously wrote in the 18th century, a woman's legal existence is suspended during the marriage, and her rights were swallowed by her husband's. She became a femme covert, a covered woman, her identity buried beneath her husband's name, her legal existence reduced to a mere extension of his. Before marriage, a woman like Mary Thompson, our fictional yet typical working-class woman, had rights. She could own property, sign contracts, and even sue in court. But once she spoke her wedding vows, everything changed. Her wages belonged to her husband. Any inheritance from her family became his, and any small business she started, whether selling bread or washing clothes, was legally his property. Even her clothing, the very dress she wore, belonged to him. If her husband chose to abuse her physically, emotionally, financially, there was no recourse. The law considered it his right to correct her as he saw fit, just as a man might train a dog or discipline a child. But what happened when Mary could no longer endure? What happened when the beatings became too much, or when her husband's drunkenness meant their children went to bed hungry? What if she met someone else, someone who treated her with kindness, offered a way out? The problem, however, was that escape through legal means was nearly impossible. In the upper classes, divorce could be an option, but it was prohibitively expensive. Before 1857, obtaining a divorce required a private act of Parliament, which could cost a fortune, about £1,000, equivalent to nearly £118,000 today. For most working-class families, that was a sum they would never see in a lifetime. Even after the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 made divorce somewhat more accessible, it was still a luxury that cost £40,000 in amount greater than the yearly wages of most laborers. For women like Mary, there were only a handful of ways to end a marriage. Separation by mutual agreement left both parties unable to remarry. A woman could simply leave, though her chances of survival were slim. She could seek a legal separation through the church courts on the grounds of adultery or cruelty, but this route was expensive, didn't allow remarriage, and often left her in a limbo state. Then, there was the possibility of dying, often in the harsh, unhealthy conditions of the working class. This was the only escape many could hope for. But the last option was the most controversial: selling her husband's property. Wife selling began in the late 17th century, a grotesque product of desperation, where the law treated women as property to be transferred like any other possession. If the legal system denied women the right to escape abusive marriages or find true freedom, the people would create their own solution. And so, wife selling, as cruel and humiliating as it was, emerged as a legitimate divorce alternative. The practice itself was shocking, but it also reflected the sad reality of a society where women had no other means of asserting their autonomy. The auctioneer, in this case the husband, would declare to the crowd the value of his wife, how much she could work, how many children she could bear, and whether she still had her teeth intact. It was a grotesque ritual, but in the twisted logic of the times, it represented the only hope for a woman like Mary to break free from a marriage that had already broken her. The origins of wife selling stretch back to the late 17th century, likely born of desperation and reinforced by folk beliefs. In a society where women were considered property, it seemed almost logical to some that they could be sold like any other possession. The practice wasn't born from cruelty alone, though cruelty played its part. It grew from a legal system that treated women as second-class citizens, where a woman's right to leave an abusive marriage, to escape, was denied. At the time, the system of coverture meant that a woman had no property rights, no independent legal standing. Her very identity was submerged into her husband's. If she could not endure the beatings, the neglect, the emotional or physical abuse, what choice did she have but to seek any means of escape available? Divorce was out of the question for the poor. It was reserved for the elite, and its cost was astronomical. If a woman wanted to separate from her husband and reclaim her life, there were very few options. In desperation, people began to see wife selling as a legal workaround, offering a crude form of freedom in an otherwise oppressive system. While the practice was grotesque, it was also strangely pragmatic. Wife selling allowed the woman or her family to take control of an impossible situation. It provided a public acknowledgement of the separation, a form of legal validation. In the eyes of the community, this act was a final seal of legitimacy, despite its clear humiliation. The rituals were as bizarre as they were heartbreaking. On the day of the sale, the husband would lead his wife to a public place, usually a market square, where livestock were sold, and position her in front of a crowd. The ritual often involved a halter or rope, or sometimes a ribbon tied around the woman's neck or waist. This wasn't just symbolic. It marked her as property to be transferred from one man to another. The sale itself began with an advertisement in the local paper. Phrases like, "John Smith will sell his wife Mary at Doncaster Market on Tuesday next. She is healthy, strong, and of good character," became a bizarre and painful norm. Some ads, however, were more personal. Thomas Brown, being tired of his wife, will dispose of her to any person willing to take her off his hands. When the crowd gathered and the bidding began, the process resembled a livestock auction. The woman was examined in much the same way as cattle or horses would be, her hands checked for signs of hard labor, her face assessed for attractiveness, and sometimes even her ability to speak was tested. The humiliation of this public display was undeniable, yet it carried a strange sense of pragmatism. The woman's fate depended on which man was willing to offer the most money, or at least appear the most trustworthy. The price paid for the woman could vary drastically, from as little as a glass of ale to hundreds of pounds, a staggering sum for working-class families. But the money wasn't the point. The real importance of the transaction was that it was witnessed by the community. The public nature of the sale acted as an informal contract, providing a form of legal legitimacy to what otherwise had no legal standing. It wasn't just about escaping an abusive marriage. It was about establishing a new, socially recognized relationship. In many cases, the woman was sold to her lover. This might seem like a form of romance, but it was also a desperate escape from a nightmare. The sale, in these instances, was a public acknowledgement of what had already been arranged in private, a way to make the separation legal. The ritual was both humiliating and empowering. In the eyes of the law, the woman was still property, but for the first time, she had some control over her fate. But not all sales were consensual. Some women found themselves being bid on by strangers, having no say in the outcome. In these situations, the auction became a terrifying ordeal, with women forced to endure the humiliation of being sold to the highest bidder. Sometimes a man they didn't know, and sometimes someone they feared. Despite the cruelty, some women actively participated in the process. In certain cases, they arranged their own sales, finding a way to escape without the possibility of returning to their original tormentor. It was a complicated, often painful process, but for some, it was their only way out. The emergence of wife selling wasn't just about men disposing of unwanted wives. It was a reaction to a legal system that failed to protect women. In many ways, it was a perverse form of self-preservation, an effort to reclaim control over an otherwise hopeless situation, yet the price paid emotionally, psychologically, and physically was immense. This practice was not just about the transaction, it was about survival in a world that offered few choices. Wife selling, in many respects, was more than just a transaction. It was a public spectacle, a drama that unfolded in the market square for all to witness. This was no quiet, private matter. It was a communal event where neighbors, friends, and even complete strangers gathered to watch the sale, often with a mix of fascination, judgment, and at times amusement. The act of selling a wife became a strange form of public theater, with its own set of unspoken rules and rituals that had to be followed for the transaction to be considered legitimate in the eyes of the community. The marketplace, traditionally a place for the exchange of goods, became the stage for a deeply personal, yet publicly acknowledged tragedy. It wasn't just a place where goods were bought and sold. It was a space where human lives were parceled out, where families were broken, and where the desperate hopes of a woman were laid bare. This public aspect of the sale provided a level of legitimacy that the private act of leaving a marriage could not. The crowd played a critical role in these events. Far from being passive observers, they were often active participants. The collective gaze of the crowd could either confirm or disrupt the transaction. If they saw a woman being treated unfairly, they might intervene. If the buyer seemed unfit or the price too low, the crowd could shift the mood, their disapproval palpable in the air. This was a ritual shaped not just by law, but by social norms and the shared understanding of what was considered acceptable within the community. There was a certain macabre entertainment value in these auctions. In the harsh, working-class world where life was hard and resources scarce, the market square became a place where people could witness the lives of others unravel in a highly charged, highly public way. The bidding was often slow at first, as the men in the crowd assessed the woman before making an offer. Some would look for signs of age or health, others would check her hands for signs of labor, and some, perhaps, would try to gauge her worth by her attractiveness. Yet, beneath this surface of transactional observation, something deeper was at play. This ritual wasn't just a matter of cold calculations. It reflected the deep power dynamics at the heart of Victorian society. Men were not just purchasing a woman's labor, they were purchasing her very life. Her future, her dignity, and her survival rested in their hands. The public nature of the sale, with its prying eyes and curious spectators, stripped away any remaining pretense of privacy or autonomy. The woman's worth was reduced to her utility and her ability to fulfill the roles expected of her as a wife, a mother, and a worker. But the woman herself was not always a passive participant. In some cases, she fought to maintain some semblance of control. One of the most striking aspects of these sales was the rare moments when a woman asserted her own agency. In some auctions, a woman might speak out, choosing the man to whom she would be sold. She would refuse the highest bidder if he seemed untrustworthy or cruel, or she might demand that the sale be conducted fairly. It was in these moments, when a woman broke the silence and spoke her mind, that the crowd would sometimes shift in her favor. For instance, consider a case in which a woman, standing on the auction block, refused to go to the highest bidder. She looked the crowd in the eye and declared, "I will go willingly, but not with a stranger. I choose Thomas Miller." This simple yet profound act of defiance broke the mold of what was expected. It shifted the balance of power from the husband and the buyer to the woman, if only for a fleeting moment. The crowd, which had been expecting a straightforward sale, suddenly found itself in uncharted territory. The crowd murmured in approval as they witnessed this rare moment of self-determination. The woman's voice, filled with a quiet dignity, commanded respect even in the most degrading of circumstances. This wasn't how wife-selling was supposed to work. The woman wasn't meant to choose her fate, but she did. And in that moment, the crowd witnessed more than just a sale. They witnessed a woman's defiant stand for what little agency she could still claim. But even in these moments of defiance, the ritual of wife-selling retained its hold. The buyer, Thomas Miller, though relieved that the auction had ended with the woman's consent, was still left to carry out a transaction that ultimately bound her to him in a way that no amount of choice could undo. In the end, she was no less his property than before. The public nature of the sale made it impossible to ignore. The crowds became witnesses, not just to the transaction itself, but to the broader questions it raised about marriage, ownership, and autonomy. These events were more than just legal transactions. They were deeply embedded in the social fabric of the community. They became a form of rough justice, a way for people to navigate the rigid, often cruel systems that governed their lives. Yet despite the crowd's involvement and the occasional acts of defiance, the woman's fate was still largely determined by the whims of the husband and the buyer. The sale, though publicly witnessed, didn't guarantee a better future for the woman. The price she paid in dignity and agency was the cost of her survival in a society that offered her little choice. When the bidding began, the dynamics of the sale shifted from the wife's fate being controlled by her husband to a new form of power, the buyer. The question that hovered over the auction block was not just whether the woman would find someone kinder than her husband, but whether the man willing to buy her would offer more than a temporary reprieve from her misery. Would he truly provide the freedom and respect she so desperately sought? Or would she simply exchange one form of subjugation for another? Buyers often approach the auction with a mix of pragmatism and desire, their motivations ranging from the need for a laborer to a man who had developed a deeper affection for the woman he hoped to acquire. The transactional nature of wife-selling allowed little room for romantic affection, but in some cases, The buyer was someone with whom the woman had already formed a private bond, perhaps a lover, a man who had courted her in secret, or a man who promised to treat her with dignity. Consider Thomas Miller, a widower who had been visiting the woman for months before the sale. As the bidding escalated, it became clear that he was prepared to offer not just money, but a promise of something better. To the woman, his bid was more than a transaction. It was a lifeline. His offer, though not the highest, was the only one that came with the possibility of genuine kindness. The crowd could see the shift in her expression as she recognized him. A moment of relief washed over her, a subtle, unspoken acknowledgement that, despite the circumstances, there was a chance for something better. But this, too, was fraught with complexity. Thomas Miller's bid, though comforting in its familiarity, was still rooted in the same system that viewed the woman as a commodity. He wasn't rescuing her from a marriage in the traditional sense. He was merely offering her a different form of ownership. The purchase of a wife in this context didn't end with a promise of freedom. It often marked the beginning of another chapter of subjugation. The woman was still bound to him by a contract that society recognized, but it was a contract that ultimately reduced her to her utility, her labor, and her ability to bear children. In some cases, the buyers were not familiar faces, but complete strangers, men who viewed the woman as little more than an object for their personal gain. This added a layer of danger to the already degrading ritual. What did it mean to be sold to a man you didn't know, someone whose treatment of you could be just as cruel, if not worse, than your previous husband's? Would the new master offer kindness, or would he be a stranger, a cold and calculating force that saw only the woman's worth in terms of what she could provide? There was a terrifying unpredictability in these sales. While the woman might hope for a compassionate new husband, the reality was that her future was entirely dependent on the whims of men who saw her not as a human being, but as a possession, just another commodity in an unforgiving world. For some women, like Sarah, the auction might offer a brief flicker of hope, a chance to escape. But in the end, the buyer still held all the power. This unpredictability was even more pronounced when the bidding involved a man who had been drinking or was otherwise emotionally compromised. The element of alcohol in wife selling cannot be overlooked. Many sales began in the local tavern, where men gathered to drink away their troubles, and the social fabric of respectability was loosened by the haze of ale. This environment contributed to the degradation of women, turning the process of selling a wife into a mockery of the institution of marriage itself. In the case of Thomas Miller, the situation was somewhat different. His bid was motivated by a personal connection to the woman, but there were still echoes of the same problem. The man was still purchasing her freedom, and that transaction, however well-intentioned, could never truly set her free. The very nature of the auction, her being sold, stripped her of her autonomy in ways that made her look, in the eyes of society, as little more than property, no different from livestock changing hands. The buyer's motivations often depended on what they thought they could get from the woman. Was she a good worker? Could she bear children? Would she make a suitable wife? These calculations played out in the bidding, and the value placed on a woman was assessed based on her ability to fulfill these roles. What was missing from this process was any consideration of the woman's own desires, her autonomy, or her rights as a human being. She was valued not for her personhood, but for her usefulness. Despite the possibility of finding a more sympathetic buyer, the structure of wife selling remained inescapable. A woman's future was determined by men who saw her as a commodity. For the women involved in these sales, the most they could hope for was that the new owner would treat them better than their previous one. But even then, there was no guarantee that the system would work in their favor. The reality was that once the auction was over, the woman was once again at the mercy of her new husband, and she could be just as trapped as before. The practice of wife selling, when examined through a modern lens, evokes horror and disbelief. How could such a brutal, dehumanizing practice have existed? But the truth is far more complicated. Beneath the cruel rituals and humiliating public displays lay the emotional and social costs that cannot be ignored. These sales were not mere transactions. They were deeply tragic moments, fraught with desperation, fear, and the heavy toll of living in a society that treated women as little more than property. For the women involved, the emotional weight of these auctions was immense. Many had already endured years of abuse, neglect, or economic hardship. The sale didn't just represent a legal transaction, it symbolized the complete loss of autonomy, the utter stripping away of personal agency. The halter around their necks was a physical mark, but the true scars ran much deeper, imprinted on their souls by the years of mistreatment and by the public nature of their auction. The trauma of being sold like livestock in front of a crowd was undeniable. Some women may have felt a sense of relief in knowing they could escape one form of torment, but the overwhelming emotions would have been complex. Was this truly freedom, or was it simply another form of imprisonment? The mere idea of being examined in public, her body scrutinized, her worth reduced to her ability to bear children, or her labor, was an experience that few could have endured without long-lasting emotional damage. The social costs of wife-selling were equally profound. While the practice was often viewed by the community as a form of rough justice, a way to solve the problem of a bad marriage, it also exposed the deeper moral contradictions of Victorian society. On one hand, the community accepted wife-selling as a practical solution to an impossible situation. On the other, it exposed the complete failure of the legal system and social institutions to protect women from abuse or allow them a fair means of escape. For the women who were sold, this ritual made their lives public. Their pain, their vulnerability, and their desperation were exposed for all to see. In the eyes of the community, they became spectacles, their suffering a form of entertainment. The crowd gathered not only to witness the transaction, but to judge the woman, often assessing her worth based on superficial qualities. They looked at her hands for calluses, her face for beauty, her body for signs of fertility. But what about her dignity? What about her right to make decisions for her own life? These questions were rarely asked, as the community fixated on the practical aspects of the transaction, how much she could work, how many children she could bear. Yet, even within the crowd, there were occasional acts of mercy. The social fabric that had long upheld wife-selling was also capable of questioning its legitimacy. There were instances when the crowd would rise in protest against a sale that seemed too harsh, too cruel. In one case, a woman, having been sold against her will, stood in defiance and refused to go with the highest bidder. The crowd, seeing her distress, intervened, disrupting the sale. This rare act of solidarity, though far from common, reveals that beneath the surface of this public spectacle, there were cracks in the social consensus. People weren't always passive. Sometimes, the community itself felt uncomfortable with the degradation of its own members. But these acts of intervention were not the norm. For most women, the sale was a harsh reality. Their personal lives, their bodies, their futures were auctioned off without their consent, all while society turned a blind eye to the deeper implications of the practice. And even when a woman was sold to someone she knew, perhaps a lover or a man she hoped would be kinder, the emotional toll was immense. She was still a commodity, still bound by the same system that saw her as less than human. Even when women actively participated in arranging their own sale, as some did, the psychological cost was still high. The idea that a woman could take part in her own transaction, perhaps as a last resort to escape her husband's cruelty, speaks to a deep resignation. It wasn't a free choice, it was the best of several painful options. In the case of women who actively sought out buyers, they were often seen as complicit in their own degradation. But this complicity was born from necessity, not desire. Their participation wasn't born of choice. It was born of survival. For the women who ended up in new marriages, the emotional scars often remained. Even if they were sold to a man who treated them with more respect, they could never escape the trauma of being auctioned in public, the humiliation of being treated like property. They were forever marked by the experience, their self-worth intertwined with the value placed on them by others. The social cost was not just on the women, but also on the communities that allowed such practices to continue. The normalization of wife-selling reflected a broader societal failure. The inability to provide women with basic legal rights, the lack of recourse for those in abusive marriages, and the moral indifference to the suffering of women in the lower classes all contributed to the persistence of this grotesque ritual. The communities that witnessed these sales were complicit, in some ways, in perpetuating the systems of inequality and oppression that allowed them to happen. The emotional and social toll of wife-selling was immense. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the practice was that, in many cases, it was the only way out. For women like Sarah, standing in the cold market square, the sale represented a desperate chance at freedom, at a life that might be better than the one she had known. But it also meant a loss of dignity, a loss of agency, and a future shaped by a system that valued her only for what she could provide. By the mid-19th century, wife-selling began to decline. The shift was gradual, influenced by a combination of social reform movements, legal changes, and evolving cultural attitudes toward marriage and gender roles. It wasn't an instantaneous moral awakening, but a slow transformation driven by both legal reforms and shifting societal norms. One of the primary reasons for the decline was the growing recognition that divorce, though still expensive and difficult to obtain, was gradually becoming more accessible. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 marked a turning point, making divorce somewhat more feasible through the courts, even for working-class people. While divorce remained a luxury for the wealthy, the working class was slowly gaining the legal rights to separate from abusive marriages and to remarry. As divorce became more accessible, the need for wife-selling diminished, though not immediately. For many women, the ritual of public auction was their only means of escaping an abusive or unhappy marriage. As legal divorce became a possibility, the public nature of wife-selling began to feel more and more like an anachronism, a brutal relic of a time when legal protections for women were non-existent or woefully inadequate. In addition to legal changes, social reform movements began to shift attitudes toward marriage, gender, and women's rights. Religious and evangelical movements played a significant role in this shift, condemning wife-selling as morally corrupt. The Salvation Army and other groups, driven by a belief in the sanctity of marriage, actively campaigned against the practice. They preached against the dehumanization of women and worked to create alternative solutions for families in crisis. However, it's important to note that even these reformers were not immune to the pressures of economic hardship and the rigid social systems that continued to limit women's options. While these reforms laid the groundwork for the eventual decline of wife-selling, they did not entirely eliminate the desperate circumstances that led to its existence. Economic hardship remained a driving force behind many of these practices. Working-class families, often living in squalid conditions and struggling with poverty, had few options for survival. Women were still largely dependent on male support for their livelihoods, and in the absence of other forms of escape, wife-selling continued to offer a cruel but practical solution. But the social stigma surrounding wife-selling was growing. By the 1840s and 1850s, the practice had begun to be seen as barbaric and disgraceful, especially by the emerging middle class, which sought to distance itself from what it perceived as the brutish behavior of the working class. The rise of a more moralistic, privatized view of marriage, where romantic love and mutual respect were seen as the ideal, painted wife-selling as a disturbing throwback to a more primitive time. Newspapers, particularly those aimed at middle-class readers, increasingly denounced the practice as a relic of a cruel and backward society. Public opinion, driven by social reformers and the increasing discomfort of the rising middle class, began to shift. Wife selling, once a public spectacle, was gradually pushed into private, more discreet transactions. These private sales, though still legally questionable, allowed the participants to avoid public shame and scrutiny. They became more about the legal fiction of property transfer than about the very public ritual of the marketplace. The practice, though still occurring, became less visible, less acceptable in the eyes of society. The late 19th century saw further shifts in attitudes, with the rise of feminism and the growing recognition of women's rights. Movements advocating for women's suffrage and equal legal rights gained momentum, contributing to the final death knell of wife selling. Legal reforms, such as the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, began to chip away at the doctrine of coverture, allowing women to keep their earnings and inheritance, which further diminished their reliance on men and their vulnerability in marriage. But even as wife-selling began to fade from the public sphere, its legacy lingered in subtle ways. The cultural attitudes that had supported the practice still shaped views of women and marriage. Women, even after the decline of the practice, continued to be seen in many ways as property, with their worth measured by their labor and their ability to fulfill traditional roles as wives and mothers. While legal reforms helped women gain more independence, the fight for full equality was far from over. The practice of wife-selling did not vanish entirely because society suddenly became more enlightened. Rather, it was the result of evolving legal frameworks, social reform, and changing economic conditions that offered women alternatives. However, many women who lived through the era of wife-selling, especially those in the working class, saw few changes in their own lives during their lifetimes. For them, divorce remained expensive and difficult to access, and the economic realities of their world were slow to change. The last documented sale of a wife occurred in 1913, a century after the practice had first emerged. By then, wife-selling had become a historical curiosity, a grotesque relic of a bygone age. The legal and social reforms of the 19th century had significantly reduced the practice, but the deeper issues it exposed, gender inequality, legal injustices, and the limitations of women's rights remained. These issues would continue to persist in different forms, but the public spectacle of wife-selling itself had disappeared, and with it, the acknowledgement of just how far society still had to go in recognizing women's humanity and autonomy. The practice of wife-selling may have officially ended by the early 20th century, but its legacy endures. It serves as a stark reminder of how legal systems, when designed to exclude and oppress, can create conditions that drive individuals to create their own, often grotesque, solutions. Wife-selling wasn't an isolated anomaly in history. It was the product of a legal framework that denied women basic rights, autonomy, and humanity. In many ways, the practice reflects broader societal struggles over property, power, and gender. At its core, wife-selling was a reflection of the legal view of women as property assets to be disposed of when no longer needed or when their worth had diminished. Women had little say in their fates, and the few options available to them were fraught with humiliation, degradation, and desperation. The auction blocks where women were sold weren't just marketplaces. They were symbols of a system that saw women not as human beings with rights, but as property with value determined by their labor and fertility. In examining the broader implications, it's crucial to consider how the systems that allowed such practices to flourish are not unique to Victorian England, nor are they as distant from our own time as we might like to believe. Many of the same issues of gender inequality, legal discrimination, and the commodification of women persist in different forms today. Contemporary discussions about gender inequality often touch on the ways in which women's rights are still, in many ways, treated as secondary to the interests of men. While we no longer sell women like property, the legal, economic, and cultural systems that continue to marginalize women have not disappeared. Consider the case of modern-day victims of human trafficking. These women, though no longer being sold in public auctions, are often treated as little more than commodities by traffickers, their futures dictated by the whims of men who see them as tools to be used for personal gain. In many parts of the world, women's labor and bodies are still commodified, their rights secondary to the demands of men, society, and the economy. Though laws have changed, the underlying social and economic conditions that make such exploitation possible have not fully disappeared. Moreover, the legacy of wife selling also shines a light on the importance of accessible legal frameworks that truly protect individuals from exploitation and abuse. As we reflect on the brutal history of wife selling, we can draw parallels to the challenges faced by women today in accessing legal recourse, especially in cases of domestic violence, sexual abuse, and economic exploitation. Legal systems must evolve to truly recognize women's rights and autonomy. This means not just making divorce accessible, but also ensuring that women can access protection from violence, fair wages, and the ability to live free from oppression. It's not just about looking back at the horrors of the past, but about ensuring that such injustices are not repeated in new forms. The story of wife selling is not just one of women being sold. It is a reflection of a legal and societal system that denied women their humanity. It calls on us to question the systems we've built and how they continue to shape lives, even today. What happens when legal systems fail to protect the most vulnerable among us? And how do we continue to build systems that serve all people, regardless of gender? There is a certain irony in the fact that the ritual of wife selling, so thoroughly tied to public spectacle, has now disappeared from view, becoming a shocking footnote in history. Yet, the questions it raises are still relevant today. How do we create systems that serve the needs of the most vulnerable, not just the powerful? How do we ensure that our laws are not only just in theory, but just in practice, especially when it comes to issues of gender equality? The end of wife selling did not mark the end of gender-based exploitation. It marked a shift in how society viewed the plight of women. The women who endured the humiliation of being sold in those market squares did not just suffer. They resisted, they survived, and they found ways to navigate the crushing weight of a system that saw them as nothing more than property. Their stories, though tragic, are also stories of resilience, of women finding ways to reclaim what little agency the law allowed them. The legacy of wife selling calls on us to remain vigilant in defending the rights of women, to recognize the ways in which gender inequality persists, and to question the systems that allow such practices to endure, even in more subtle forms. Just as we cannot forget the women who wore halters around their necks and stood in front of crowds, we must remember that the struggle for equality is ongoing. The echoes of the past remind us that freedom is not guaranteed, that dignity is not a given, and that the price of justice is constant vigilance against systems of oppression. As we reflect on the history of wife selling, we are reminded of the long journey toward justice and equality for women. It is a journey that continues today. Let us honor the memory of the women who endured such degradation by ensuring that the legal and social systems we build today protect their dignity, their rights, and their humanity. The marketplace is empty now, but the questions raised by the practice of wife selling remain as urgent today as they were in the past. We must ask ourselves, what kind of society are we building, and how can we ensure that no one is ever again forced to choose between dignity and survival?